Yes, you're just saying hello and welcome. I'm Steve Collin, then passing it to me, and I will introduce the panel, whatever.
Okay.
So this audience, there's a lot of, some computer scientists, some journalists, some educators. Good crowd.
Great.
Okay. So can I?
Yes, I can.
I can for the,
Are we live streaming, or are we?
We are live streaming, yes.
Okay.
And we have thumbs up.
And this is the beginning of the public portion of the conference, correct?
This is a public event, yes.
Yes. Welcome, everybody. I'm still taking notes from Emily. I'm Steve Call. I'm the Dean of the Journalism School here at Columbia, and I just wanted to introduce this afternoon's conference and maybe just offer one or two bits of context for you. So first of all, welcome. This is the space of the Brown Institute for Media Innovation and the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia. Emily, of course, leads Tao, and Mark Hansen, who many of you know, leads Brown. And these are two institutions that have really changed Columbia, the whole university, as well as our graduate school, under their great leadership. And just to explain a little bit about how we think of our agenda, since this conference is shared by them and is part of what they do, Tao is the main research arm of the journalism school, concerned with the relationship between changing technologies and the public purpose of journalism. And I want to circle back to that formulation because it's not quite the same as a lot of other terrific research institutes that are working alongside us in some of these fields. And Mark's mission is innovation and narrative and story and audience engagement through technology, and he's lashed up with Stanford and makes commitments to small teams who are creating new ways of telling stories, sometimes teams that are built bi-coastally with Stanford engineers and Columbia journalists, but lots of different kinds of teams. So if you're interested in that, you should make sure to knock on his door while you're here and learn more. Today, the subject of artificial intelligence and journalism, brings us together, I gather. I'm sorry to have missed this morning, but it sounded like that closed portion of the conference went really well, and now we launch a public conversation around many of the same themes. And I mean, for what it's worth, my own thinking is that this is exactly the field of emerging technology that most implicates journalistic practice looking out over the next 5 or 10 years, if you were to guess. And the part of our purpose is to make sure that as this evolution occurs, it's connected to debates about the core public purpose of journalism, not just change, not just efficiency, not just even new ways that publishers connect with audiences, but the constitutional design in which journalism functions, and trying to close or improve journalism's performance inside that design. So it's a conversation about, for example, this vexing gap that we have in the United States today, where professional reporting about the performance of local government, city government, state government, has collapsed with newspaper business models. And yet there is more public information available in digital archives about government at those same levels than at any time in the country's history. And can't artificial intelligence, some of you, in conversation with journalists about what it is journalists used to do when they turned up at school board meetings to monitor decision making, can't we find a way to connect some of these emerging opportunities to close this gap, to figure out how to deliver to communities the information they used to rely on reporters to deliver in an analog era? And then there's the ethical questions that will be such a part of tonight's, this afternoon's discussions about the engagement between engineers and journalists and philosophers and humanists about our obligations when we write code. We know we live in a world where code is power. We know that the power that code creates isn't always transparent, even to the people who create it. And so we're in an era where we have to figure out how to frame those questions and explore them in depth. So I'm really proud of Mark and Emily for organizing this, excited to see such a talented and interesting group here for the discussion. And with that, let me welcome you one last time and turn it over to Emily for the show.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. I'm Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Tower Centre. Thank you very much indeed for coming out here on what I believe is quite a warm afternoon outside. And we'll try and keep you aerated and sort of hydrated. There's water at the back. As Steve was saying, one of the things that we have a mission to do at the journalism school is really look at sort of interdisciplinary issues and how they affect the field. We have great colleagues here in our computer science school, and we have a dual degree which trains graduate students in both being journalists and in being computer scientists in a kind of a pretty unique program. And we also have a student body now which is about 20% either computational journalists or data concentrators, which is a really big change for the school. However, that said, when we look at what's coming down the line, particularly the things that can be achieved now through machine learning, big data sets, all we can sort of think about in the field of journalism is how perhaps inadequately equipped we are, particularly when one looks at kind of the forces of other larger technology companies, to really sort of keep pace with and think about exactly as Steve says, how we both employ the tools, how we configure our newsrooms, but also how we think about those much broader issues of what news is. So we have a great program this afternoon, which we will kick off in a second with Nick Diakopoulos, who is a fellow at the Tower Centre, but he's also a computational journalist with his own algorithmic accountability lab at the University of Maryland. So we have, as I say, the housekeeping is we will have a break at 2 o'clock. It says coffee break. It will be cold refreshments. And then we have a one-on-one discussion after that. And then we'll close with a final panel. I'm just going to say sort of that if you need the restrooms, they're one floor down. Sorry, I always forget these things. And I'm also going to say thank you to the organising team here at TAU, particularly George King, who's a senior fellow who pulled this programme together. Well done, George. And John Keegan, who has helped him in this, who is a senior research fellow, who we recently stole from the Wall Street Journal, which I'm very pleased about, and that represents an extremely good union of how we think about, if you like, kind of the fields of computer science interacting with the fields of journalism. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite the first panel up on stage. We were missing somebody in a traffic jam. I don't know whether oh, Gerry's here. That's great. So if I'm going to invite the first panel up onto stage, I'm going to pass over to Nick so that he can... And please excuse our lack of microphones. We have to get people to pass microphones among themselves.
I'm going to sit at the end here. You're going to need to... Oh, that's me, yeah. Hello. We all settled here, guys? Great. Hi, I'm Nick Diakopoulos. Welcome. As Emily mentioned, I'm a professor of journalism and computer science at the University of Maryland, although soon I'll be joining Northwestern University. I'll be your moderator for today's panel on exploring the ethics of AI-powered products. We have 6 absolutely stunningly amazing speakers here to talk about this topic, so I'm mostly just going to get out of the way. I will let them introduce themselves, in fact, for maybe 2-3 minutes each. And I'll keep it brief myself as moderator to be sure that we have time to get into some of these really interesting, meaty ethical questions here that AI creates. But maybe just a few words before we kind of jump into introductions to try to frame things a little bit. AI, artificial intelligence, and by that I want to be clear what I mean by that. I mean automation that mimics intelligent human behavior. AI has recently been gaining some traction within news production practices. Things like data mining, things like event detection, fact-checking, headline writing and optimization, automated writing algorithms for creating stories in sports and finance and politics, interactive chatbots on Facebook Messenger for explaining things like Brexit. Also increasingly things like what the news editors of yesteryear did, selecting and prioritizing content for distribution. Virtually the entire pipeline of news production is now being touched in some way to varying degrees of quality by automation. These systems, of course, are brittle. They can be brittle. They often only work in closely scripted scenarios and for very routine coverage and editorial decision making. And I think that actually creates some very interesting space for ethical questions to be able to tackle here. Things like how far do we really want to push autonomy and AI in the media? What are the risks of broad adoption of AI in the media? Will journalists become complacent with the decisions that AI creates? Will we become too trusting of automation? For machine learning, there's certainly interesting, challenging questions about the ethical collection and usage of data in AI applications. So, at the end of the day, I think ethics is really concerned with apt behavior and conduct and making tough trade-offs in hard decisions. And I think we are still sort of in the early stages of deciding what apt behavior means for AI and for the people who wield the power created through AI. So having sort of said those few words, I'd like to sort of go down the line here in order and have each panelist do a quick 2 to 3 minute introduction and to sort of help enlighten us a little bit about particular areas of ethical friction in AI. I've asked each person, each panelist, to also offer up one AI ethics question that they've been confronted with or that they've had to consider in their work in some way. So I will pass it along down to you.
My name is... Did that work? Okay. I'll do the one that takes the microphone testing for all of us. My name is Amanda Lewandowski. I co-teach the Technology, Law, and Policy Clinic at NYU Law. What we do at the clinic is a variety of projects for real legal clients to make sure that technology is working in the service of people rather than people working in the service of technology. And I think that artificial intelligence or AI is a place where this really becomes a question at the forefront. And the reason is because we are now at a point where when we're talking about all of these different types of specific technologies that are broadly referred to as AI, whether that's natural language processing or machine learning or neural nets, you may have heard about some of these in news articles because now there's journalism about these techniques. They all require a vast amount of data about people, generated by people. And the question I've been exploring in my work is, how does a journalist obtain that legally? Because even though people don't think about it, anytime you make a copy of an article or a book or a selfie, whether that's for teaching a machine how to talk like a person, think like a person, this is all sort of metaphorical, but trying to teach it the different ways in which humans use language or what a face looks like, more specifically perhaps what a cat face looks like, you need a ton of data to show it. And oftentimes that data requires making copies, and any copy that's made without authorization potentially poses a risk of legal liability. And what I've been focusing on in my work is, what does it mean for a journalist to obtain data both legally and ethically? Because just because data is publicly available does not necessarily mean that it's legally available, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's necessarily ethically available. There's a lot of different questions around what public means, especially online. Does it make a difference if you show it to a small group of people or a large group of people? What does it mean when you feel comfortable disclosing personal information on a dating website versus your public Twitter account versus a LinkedIn profile? Or if you choose to make all of those private, what does it mean to disclose that information? And we're at a very difficult point right now where the companies that are most capable of advancing this technology toward what some would describe as, quote, accuracy, accurate facial recognition of saying, you showed me a bunch of images, I can identify which of these images are faces. There are companies who can build that data or buy it. It is not democratized in a way, in part because of these legal restrictions. So considering how these legal restrictions can inform the ethics and how an ethics can inform those legal restrictions, I think is really important. And I have some thoughts about solutions, but right now I'd rather pose the question.
Okay, I'm Madeline Ellish. I'm a researcher at Data and Society, which is a research institute downtown looking at social implications of data-driven technology. I'm also an anthropologist by training, actually over in Schermerhorn for the last, I won't say how many years, but a soon to no longer be graduate student, very exciting. And in my work at Data and Society, I'm particularly interested not only in the new kinds of interactions that AI-driven technologies are creating, but also in the kinds of conditions for human work that those technologies are leaving in their wake. And the kinds of human labor that is valued, and actually the kinds of ways in which humans can be valued. I also wanted to take in this sort of introduction to sort of say what I mean by ethics when I use the term, because I think often when we have conversations around AI, around ethics of anything, there's a lot of collapsing of terms. And so I think Nick mentioned it, but I'll just amplify his point that ethics is not necessarily the same as discussions of fairness to me. They both have to do with justice, but for better or worse, they require us to think about different questions and the politics of different questions and different frameworks in different ways. And so for me, ethics is about finding the right questions to ask at the beginning, I think we were saying, as opposed to, or throughout the process of designing a product. And in terms of what is the toughest ethical question that I've been confronted with, I think I had to think a long time about this, but I think it has to do, again, with this idea of how do we evaluate trade-offs in decision-making. Specifically, I think it's really hard in the context of healthcare. So for instance, in a data-driven technology, how should we go about thinking about how to evaluate the well-being of the individual over the group? So essential questions about public health that I think are really brought to a point in new applications of technology when we can really individualize healthcare. A whole new set of ethical dilemmas are brought up about the individual versus the group. Hopefully I can talk more about that.
Hi, I'm Gerry Halton. I'm the first engineering manager on the search, learning, and intelligence team at Slack, which for those of you that don't know is a technology company building the business operating system of the future, centered around messaging that aims to make people's working lives, we really are, that's what we're doing, I promise, that aims to make people's working lives simpler, more pleasant, and more productive. I did my doctoral work at Stanford, sort of at the intersection of machine learning and human-computer interaction in the computer science department there. Worked as a researcher for a few years, founded a startup that was backed by Andreessen Horowitz and NEA, failed miserably, lost all of their money, which I guess is a very in vogue thing to do these days in startup land. At least we weren't making a juice machine. And then kind of in the ashes of that failure, went and joined this incredibly interesting dynamic team at Slack. It's tasked with sort of applying machine intelligence and machine learning to all of the communication that happens when you're doing work. And I should stipulate, I guess, like right up front that I know absolutely nothing about journalism whatsoever. But I do think that the problems that we face at Slack are sort of relevant to this discussion for two reasons. The first being that Slack has kind of found a foothold in so many newsrooms across the country and is becoming part of the way that a lot of reporters work and communicate and share information. And secondly, because we have the same sort of responsibility in the sense that the information that we're trying to operationalize for people, it's not pictures of cats. It's very important stuff that sits around how you work and how your company works and how you communicate with your coworkers. So we have that same sort of responsibility as journalists do in the world to really get this right, or very bad things happen when we screw up. And one of the ethical problems that I think we spend a lot of time talking about in SLI at Slack, I think again kind of harkens over into the field of journalism. We have a lot of things that we would like to measure. We'd like to be able to build predictive models that look at a particular piece of communication, maybe like a story, and tell you how important it is or how good it is. That's a very difficult thing to do. It's kind of an ill-posed problem in the same way that if you took a piece in the New York Times and tried to build a predictive model to tell you whether it was a good story or not. And so what we're left with are these predictive models that are correlated with those things, but not exactly the same. For instance, on news pieces published online, we can kind of look at predicting clicks and virality and adoption. And that's close to importance, but it's different, it's distinct. And so figuring out that gap between the things that we can actually predict and what we are using those things as proxies for, that's a very tricky ethical problem. And when you forget that there's this gap between what you can predict and what you actually wish you could predict, I think very bad things happen. And so we spend a lot of time talking about that internally.
Hi, I'm Angela Basa. I am the Director of Data Science at iRobot, so I'm glad that I'm not the only non-journalist here today. The way that I think about ethics in AI, I mean, I'm a recovering data scientist. I'm not a data scientist anymore. I'm management, which in terms of actually executing on these things means I'm pretty useless. But I am part of the conversations about how these products get built, how these products get marketed, how these products get communicated, what trade-offs are we willing to make. And it took me a while to find a company where I could work at and where they valued ethics as much as I did. It should be easier, but it's not. So when you're in industry, it's difficult to find people who are as concerned about ethics as I am. So my path was circuitous. I started on Wall Street, so I used to live in New York. That didn't work out for me. I worked with pharmaceutical strategies, so we were dealing with these complex models. I'm a mathematician by training. And how do you subsidize copays for certain patients but not others? People who were already going to pay money for a particular drug, how do you make sure that you don't give them money because they wouldn't have needed it, but you give money to people who would have needed it, otherwise they wouldn't take the drug? Seems pretty ethical, seems like a really good thing to do. Turns out that's not usually how the bills get paid. But in terms of how I think about the ethics right now, the data that is used to power these machine learning algorithms, these natural language processing algorithms, these computer vision algorithms, these localization and mapping algorithms, all of the things that now fall under the umbrella moniker of AI. The thing that I like to think about is math doesn't care. Math is sort of like the honey badger. Math is math. The thing that changes is the data. And there are editorial considerations of which math you use. That's something that we have an ethical mandate to evaluate correctly. There's also the component of when the data is collected. So sure, I have a beautiful data set that I'm feeding into an algorithm, but that's not how data gets incepted. That data gets collected somehow, and we like to imagine that it's collected in these hermetically sealed, beautiful ways where you have these researchers in hazmat suits going into the field and collecting. That's not how it works. How it works is you have a bunch of people at a phone bank making calls, trying to figure out proxy measures for what you're actually trying to infer, for which there are no better alternatives on how to collect that data. And especially in the role that I play right now, where these robots, I mean, iRobot is the premier consumer robot company right now. They are a company that's been around for a while, so they have failed in really constructive ways, and now we find ourselves at a juncture where these robots are in your homes. And that is your most private data, it's your most private space, because it's not just inhabited by you. I mean, when your phone data leaks, that's a problem. But what happens when your toddler's data leaks and your toddler doesn't have a phone yet? So how do we not just prevent that from happening, but how do we treat that data very carefully? Because if you've gone to a store and you've bought this robot, you want that robot to do something for you. And if we're going to make that robot do amazing things with AI, that is predicated on the data that is being fed into those algorithms, both in the training setting, but also in the execution setting when the robots are in the wild. And so what data do we store? What data do we beam back? What data do we make available to you? What data do we make available to me? So there are certain things that the robot is looking at that I am not even privy to after the fact. The robot forgets by design, so that that data is not vulnerable. So those are the kinds of considerations that I'm evaluating the trade-offs, and that's why this topic is incredibly important to me.
Hey, I'm Gilad Lawton, and I lead the data science team at BuzzFeed. So we're a news and media company, and I think the one of the most unique things about BuzzFeed is that very early on, it made this decision to go fully distributed. And so we don't care at BuzzFeed whether someone consumes our content on Snapchat or on our app. Like it's as valuable for us to serve users wherever they are. So the outcome of that is that we have this incredible breadth of audiences, both on our own site and apps, but also across social networks, right? And so we're very active on Snapchat, very active on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube, and we also collect a lot of data. So it's really, really important for us to learn as much as we can about what our audiences are doing, what they're consuming, what's performant, and how to sort of understand that and take actions on that. And so internally, the culture is very sort of pro-data, as you would say, and there are a wide variety of tools that we've built in-house that give every person in the company capabilities to look at whatever performance data we have, right, we've collected. And so it really, to me, and as someone who comes from tech, it doesn't feel like I work in media or in a publisher, but really in a tech organization that has this incredible internal stack and really sort of thinks strongly of data and taking right actions based on data. So I think this distributed piece is something that's very unique about BuzzFeed. Additionally, the fact that everyone has access to data, everyone across the company, is also quite unique. And then just the investment in the data infrastructure, internal tools, from BI tools to just tools we built in-house that help content creators as well as sales people make decisions based on data. All right, so obviously machine learning and now sort of artificial intelligence have become really interesting way to effectively make better recommendations than we've had before. So we're very interested and we're starting to sort of figure out where we could better leverage some of these advances. We don't do as much sort of generation using these techniques, but rather classification, prediction. So for example, stuff we care about are how do we make sure our content has the optimal route across our different properties given some sort of something we're trying to optimize for, whether it's users sharing the content or whether it's users spending a lot of time on the content, right? So the routes that typically happen in across publishers are using various ranking systems to sort of sort feeds, right, and adapt feeds that appear on site. We also use multi-armed bandits for that. It's great when you have control on your site, but what do you do in the distributed landscape, right, where you have less control? You can't actually run A/B tests. So you have to get much better at predictive capacity, right, and try to identify, given whatever information you have about the current performance of a piece of content on a Facebook page or in a series, right, when you look at sequential storytelling on Snapchat or Instagram, what is the next thing that I should do with this content? Where else should it go in order to optimize for whatever I'm trying to reach, or which other piece of content should go here? So in a lot of these places, we're making currently very manual decisions, and we like to think of some of these technologies as sort of amplifying and enhancing the capabilities of our curators and editors. And just with regard to some of the toughest ethical questions that we wrangle with, I think a lot of them come back to what data should we be storing, and when do we not store data, which is something we've thought about a lot and actually have decided to go forth with many times.
Hi, I'm John Keefe. I work in the bot studio and am on the product team at Quartz. And the bot studio is tasked with a couple of things right now. First off, we're looking at conversational interfaces. So that's software you can chat with for journalism and information, software you can talk with, so through an Alexa or Google Home or the like, again, in the context of journalism and information, And also tools for journalists to do their jobs better, primarily in Slack, because apparently 100% of journalists use Slack or something close to that. I don't know. But our plan is to have actually conversational bot-driven tools, a little suite of them that we could provide to all y'all by the end of the year. So we're looking to do that. And along the way, we're being very open about this. We're blogging about what we're doing. We're trying to share our explorations. Undergirding all of this is, of course, artificial intelligence, machine learning. So we're experimenting with that as well in a lot of crazy contexts, some of them useful, some of them playful, but all of them to the notion that either we're going to be using these systems to drive these conversational interfaces or helping journalists do their jobs better. And so the whole sort of architecture of this is that we're working on where the humans are interfacing with the artificial intelligence, and that is often through a bot or a conversation. And I guess sort of in that context, my ethical thing that has come up recently, just because I'm interested in it, has been maybe less on the AI side, but on the responsibility of a developer or a coder or a creator, especially at a media company, on how we deal with the abuse that comes at bots. Apparently people like to abuse bots, it turns out, whether they're talking to them or chatting with them. And so as a journalist, how do we think about calling people out on that, cutting them off, and doing those kinds of things, which are ethical dilemmas I don't know that I ever expected to run into. So.
All right, thanks so much. A couple things I was hearing over and over again. One was data. It seems like data is a bit of a locus in terms of where ethical decisions could be made. But I'm also thinking about more broadly, ethics in the algorithm or the ethics of the human designer. I wonder if panelists could sort of speak to that. When we talk about ethics of AI, should we be talking about the ethics of the people building the AI, the ethics of the autonomy itself, or the ethics of the data? Where should we sort of focus our attention here?
I'll just jump in as a kind of a preface, which is that I think that part of really effectively grappling with the ethical questions at stake is to realize the actual limitations of the technology. And so I think that it's important that we not conflate autonomy, something that is fully autonomous, and the kinds of AI, or more specifically machine learning, that we're seeing right now. I think that it's important to realize that right now, deployed AI, we'll just use the big buzzword, it is, let's say that it is automating a task, but in a very particular prescribed domain. And so to realize that there are really discrete boundaries around what these programs can and cannot do. And I think that this becomes an ethical question because when we start to assign too much power to the idea of a software program, we forget all of the kinds of agencies that humans have over the different aspects that go into building these systems. And so to your question about, is it the human designers, is it the data? I mean, to me, it's all of the above. There's no point at which building a system does not have some sort of ethical decision that needs to be considered.
I'd say one place that was really interesting one experience that was interesting for me to be a part of was when we integrated automation into our ranking system. So on site, it used to be that there was pretty much full manual control to editors on with what content appears where. And then we went through this process of automation, right? Like with automation, we're testing out these solutions that had massive boost in performance if we leverage them, right? But obviously there's a lot of fear and just worry from the newsroom. Okay, what does this mean? Or content creators now, like we have these robots controlling what content appears on our homepage, right? Or and so I think going through this process and one building up trust, but also agreeing on what we're willing to sort of let go, where the boundaries are, and what we are willing to automate, and also giving sort of levers that enable control. So while the system is automated, there are levers that could be pulled by editors and say, well, in these positions, there will always be curated content by default. And like, we can move away from that and automate that if we want, but the default is manual curation for certain spots, or sort of the ability to tweak the algorithmic system, giving boost to certain pieces of content. So adding these levers ended up being really, really important, but also sort of giving the ability or sort of having ways to understand what's going on and at least feel like you're in control, even if you aren't fully in control. I think it was a really important learning from this sort of process of semi-automation.
So I kind of want to take advantage, because we have several industry people on the panel. One of the sort of reactions or responses to, creating more ethical decision-making around algorithms has been transparency, algorithmic transparency. Can we open up? Can we get more disclosure? Can we understand a little bit more about the data, about the algorithm, about how it was designed or how it's been deployed and implemented? And I just kind of wanted to float that to the panel, particularly maybe to the industry panelists. What are your reactions to transparency? Is that a viable option toward moving toward a more kind of ethical implementation of AI for society?
I love that you called it an option, because it's a choice that you have to either make or abdicate responsibility for. So in a previous life, in a previous job, one thing that we did is we had these machine learning automated algorithms in production that did anomaly detection. So this was for the electric grid and how those transactions get settled in demand response. Super complicated, and I'm happy to discuss with anybody who cares what that is after. But essentially what we were doing is we were looking at the data that was coming from the electric grid, and we were looking for outliers that would have thrown off the math that we were looking to do downstream. And as we were developing those algorithms, we made the conscious choice that interpretability and transparency were going to be things that we were going to trade off other benefits, perhaps even in precision, in order to be able to have. Why? Because anything that you do with the electric grid is incredibly regulated. And so we needed to be able to substantiate the choices that our algorithms were making, which meant we couldn't use the most cutting edge, latest and greatest, but that was an alternative that we had a conscious process of making. And I think that's what everyone needs to understand, is that these editorial decisions happen all the time. They happen in which algorithms you use. It happens in how you value algorithms and what your priorities are, whether transparency is a priority or precision is a priority or scalability is a priority. So for instance, we were doing this on every single piece of data that came into our system. So another thing that we had to prioritize was speed. So these algorithms that we were using had to be computationally non-intensive. Otherwise, the results were going to back up, and they were just going to continue backing up faster than we could process them. So those are decisions that we have to recognize that they are in our hands, and if we abdicate the responsibility for them, it doesn't mean that they don't get made. It just means that the accountability then falls through to a point where it's perhaps not even recoverable.
And I would really echo those sentiments. I think I love to get in trouble at these things, so I'll say something polemic again. I think it's sort of a shame when you look at kind of the educational system right now around machine learning. A lot of the focus in terms of publishing is when you take an established data set that someone has established a baseline around, and then if you can beat whatever the best performance is for that particular data set, even if it's by 0.1% or 0.2%, that's a substantial publishable result in general on problems. And it kind of certainly is painting everybody with a broad brush here, and it's tremendously unfair, but it leads to this sort of over-focus on, as long as we can drive that number up and to the right over time, that's the thing that matters the most. And certainly it does matter. If you're, I don't know, doing high frequency trading or something like that, and you can get a 0.1% increase, well, there's your beach house in, I don't know, wherever, some nice place that has beach houses. But that focus on just increasing precision and recall kind of tends to sweep under the rug this, can we explain why these predictions are being made? And I think what we've found in our work, much like yours, is we will happily take a worse model that we know is worse, that we can explain, that we can look at and say, we learned this set of weights. These weights correspond to features that are human interpretable. If we don't like one of the weights on one of these features, we'll just change it because we can do that. And oftentimes that ends up being a much more efficient way to iterate, a much more efficient way to learn, and a much better way to build things that you put in front of customers rather than just saying, hey, we drove some precision number up and to the right over time.
And I think there's an additional point of we're talking about transparency, but also explainability, whether you can articulate what the machine is doing. Transparency, to me at least, and I think to some of the other folks on the panel, is more, are we telling you what's in our data set? Are we telling you what the algorithm says? Are we telling you what the weights of some of these features are? But there's definitely ways to create AI that is unethical and explainable, or unethical and transparent. You can certainly imagine ways where it does a very garbage thing, but you can be like, well, that's exactly what the garbage is. I can explain it to you perfectly. Or the algorithm is totally transparent. We put our garbage data set with our garbage algorithm up on GitHub. You can go download it and make some more garbage of your own. And I think the foundational question is, how good is the data that we're using? And I say good, meaning that, is it accurate? Is it unbiased? Is it precise? Those are all different ways that are incorporated into good, which is a very mushy metric. And also you can have something that is incredibly precise, incredibly accurate, that is also in some cases perceived as unethical. And I'll give you a couple of examples of the data question, because when it comes to legal context, some of the reason that there's not more transparency or more explainability is because companies they're risk adverse, much like lawyers. I am trained as a lawyer. I am currently a practicing lawyer. We don't like risk. Risk makes us very uncomfortable. We are not the move fast and break things. We're move at a glacial pace and see what happens, and then maybe move a little more depending on how the day is feeling. And when it comes to this data question, there is an attraction to data that has a perceived low legal risk and is easily accessible. And the key example that will be very familiar to the computer scientists in the room is the Enron data set, which we're going to talk about. That's an example of both an ethical and a garbage question. If you're not familiar, the Enron emails are 1.6 million real emails between various employees of the Enron Corporation that were posted publicly by a government agency in the early 2000s. All of the emails, very minimal redaction, retooling, whatever. And understandably, computer scientists were like, this seems like a very rich data set for potentially teaching machines how humans use language. So a number of different machine learning algorithms have been trained on this Enron data set, including things like spam detection, right? 1.6 million emails. You're going to see a lot of Viagra ads in there that you can just flag as spam, filter that out, teach everyone's inbox. That's not what to do. Again, I'm anthropomorphizing, but that's a simplification. But when you think about how people use language using a data set by oil and gas guys in Houston who were convicted of fraud, there's a lot of biases that are going to be baked into that data set that are being handed down and not just imitated by machines, but sometimes amplified because of the scale or perpetuated. And so much so that now, even though very many machine learning algorithms have been trained or touched by this data set, there are entire research papers dedicated to exploring the gender, race, power biases that are actually baked into this data set. And another similar version that's a little bit more contemporary than 2003 is Wikipedia. I love Wikipedia. I am an editor of Wikipedia, and I have been for quite some time. But it's very biased. It's very skewed in terms of who contributes to Wikipedia. And there was recently some data released by Catherine Mayer of the Wikimedia Foundation illustrating that many machine learning algorithms and AI technologies are trained using Wikipedia articles for facts because it's Creative Commons licensed. So this goes back, easily accessible, low perceived legal risk. Going back to the Enron data set, the low legal risk would be, I guess, someone could sue you for copyright infringement, but that seems pretty unlikely. Wikipedia is often edited by men, and even if you're just using it for, quote, facts, what facts are included really matter. You could get a, quote, lot of facts about Rob Gronkowski from Wikipedia, whose article is novella-esque, and you could not find a single fact about the first woman who was admitted to the New York State Bar because she does not have an article. So even things that are, quote, neutral like facts can actually be incredibly biased. And there has to be a question about Well, as an ethical matter, do we care about whether there's low friction in terms of accessing and using this data? Do we want to privilege whether we're going toward a higher goal? And the other question is for journalists who are doing the hard legwork of actually collecting data sets, there's a lot of steps between the journalist and the general counsel of a newsroom who decides whether that data set can be released to the public. And the concerns and trade-offs are not just accuracy, fairness, transparency, explainability, ethics, but also it might be accurate. This might be an accurate reporting of some of intelligence that we've received, but it could really open the newsroom, the individual journalist, to source up to legal risk. And if we feed it to an algorithm, if we show that, we release the algorithm to public, the data set becomes public as well, if that's how we just do it, what kinds of other risks are we opening ourselves up to? Which is an ethical mess, which is part of why I'm glad to not work in a newsroom. I get to be the legal scholar who gets to be like, well, here's all the mess you have to sort out. But it's really hard. It's really challenging.
I'd like to echo everything you said, everything. But in terms of I just like to make it stronger, which is to say,
yes,
it's not that data can be biased, it's that data is biased. Yes. All data is biased. All data are artifacts of systems, and systems are built by humans. It's still, to this day, they still are. Maybe they won't be, but right now they are. And they are built on choices, and those choices may be very well explained. They may be rational choices, but they are choices nonetheless. And so every time that you're going to use a data set, my recommendation is to understand the system that was used to generate that data and I think the word bias is a little scary. They're choices. And so if you're going to use data, you have to understand how that data got generated, what the purpose of it was, and you use contemporary data sets. I'm gonna throw back to the 1860s. So the way that clothing is categorized between small, medium, and large is because of how folks in the military in the 1860s were proportional. So it used to be that you had to manually make all of the uniforms, and so the way that they figured out how to clothe an entire battalion of fighters is to segment between small people, medium people, and large people. But they weren't people. They were incredibly athletic males of the 19th century. But we still use that same concept for how clothing is made today. Is that data set garbage? For some uses, absolutely, but it's not intrinsic to the data set that the data set is biased or unethical. It's just there were choices that were made, and that data set was purpose-built. And so what happens a lot in industry, especially, is unless there's some primary collection mechanism, which is incredibly expensive and incredibly valuable, there's a lot of secondary data that gets used, especially in prototyping, especially in proof of concepts, which are reused for a different purpose. And so that's really when the risks start seeping in, because there's a lot of inattention to that repurposing.
And this is, I think, extremely relevant for journalism as well, given that most of the data journalism that's done is done using secondary data sources. There really is just a very small fraction of data journalism that is kind of original sources. But I kind of wanted to pick up on something that John alluded to earlier in terms of, people being abusive to the bots that you're building, and thinking through, what are sort of the boundaries of what we think is acceptable for someone to be able to say, or when do we cut them off, and these kinds of things. And I kind of wanted to use that as a jumping off point to talk about internationalization of ethics and different norms around things like censorship and what's appropriate to say or not say, whether it's to a bot or to another human being. And I think this comes up is more and more for news organizations in terms of moderation of content. And the New York Times is rolling out technology built by Google to help moderate online comments. Facebook, comes up against content moderation types of questions. When we're thinking through the ethics of, deploying automation to make some of these types of decisions, what do we need to be aware of as far as internationalization, and how sensitive to that do we need to be?
I think that's a good question. I'll just touch on a couple of things to consider. I certainly don't have the answer to that. One is that a lot of what has been trained for things like natural language processing and other things, except maybe at Google, is based in English. I mean, it's the biggest hurdle right now. There's very little that we can do as sort of third or fourth party people to try to do natural language processing on other languages. It's just not as easy to do. So that's a big hurdle right off the bat. And then since I've raised it, the abuse discussion is just interesting to me that a colleague of mine, Leah Fessler, wrote a story for Quartz about how Siri and Alexa and Google Home respond to direct sexual harassment. And the results are pretty shocking. Everything from now to thanks for the feedback. And then it becomes this issue like, wait, what? Like, how about that's wholly inappropriate and I'm cutting you off or whatever. So that's the kind of thing that her story really got me thinking as we were building these bots, like what is our role in like addressing those things and how do we go about doing that? We haven't answered that. So sort of half not answering both of your questions, if anybody else has another shot.
I also think that it's not just an internationalization question. Even in just trying to limit your universe to just English, like you just gave two examples, Siri and Alexa, which both have women-sounding gendered names, which may be more correlated to attracting or abuse from other users of the system. But the question of even how to interpret different contexts for how people use language in English, just to limit it a little bit, because it is such a huge, varied question. I think John's point about, we don't have the kinds of rich data sets in every language in order to accommodate all of these things yet. And even in English, it's challenging. So in trademark law, there was a lawsuit, and there's actually a lawsuit still pending at the Supreme Court about whether an Asian American rock band featuring a man named Simon Tan, he's one of the parties in the lawsuit, can call their band the Slants. And by call their band, I mean register it as a federal trademark, but that's so boring for most of you, so I'll just say use the name. And for him, he thinks of that as the name of their band. It's a term of empowerment. That's what they want to be called. And to the United States Patent and Trademark Office examiner who looked at their application, they thought that was a racial slur. And even though a white person could have come and registered the Slants, and indeed there are many slant registrations on the federal trademark register, this guy can't because he's Asian American and it will be perceived as a slur. And there's another previous case called Dykes on Bikes. There's contexts in which the queer folks who are members of Dykes on Bikes, which is a San Francisco but now US-based and now actually international motorcycle group of enthusiasts, they tried to register a federal trademark as well. They felt totally comfortable using a word that has different connotations for different communities. And if that word was used with a chatbot, really context dependent on whether that would be flagged as harassment or spam or a slur. And a human might not even be well positioned to make that decision. The trademark examiner certainly wasn't. They initially said that couldn't be registered as a federal trademark. And then after more than 90 additional submissions, hundreds of pages from many queer folks who identified using that term said, how dare you tell me what I can and cannot call myself? What a strange imposition of a US Patent and Trademark Officer on me as a human being to say what you call yourself and identify as is a slur so disparaging we can't recognize it on the Federal Trademark Register. There are many, many words I'm sure that we can think of where there would be different feelings amongst different communities, and the idea that we can find a way to moderate all of that is very strange because it requires us to engage in that same sort of linguistic essentialism of saying all people will feel this way about one word, all people will use a word a particular way or a phrase, and in some cases it might be really simple, but in some cases I think it's super complicated, and that's one of the challenges of just using human language and trying to automate it is that we don't even understand all of the ways that we use language, so it'll be very difficult to come up with rules to teach a machine or to explain to a machine what they should be doing with it.
So I think there's a lot of tension here. Yeah.
I just want to quickly return to actually I totally agree, Amanda, everything with what you're saying. I think it's important to return to, you use the phrase internationalizing, but kind of what do we do with global deployments of technology? And I think that that's a really important question that actually communities that have been beginning to talk about the kind of ethical uses of AI need to engage with more, because I think that there can be, and we might say that there is, new dynamics of colonialism in technology that are developing. And ethics whether ethics is not the only sort of reach that needs to. Oh, all right. Well, I see we're running out of time, but I just kind of wanted to get that phrase in because I think it's really, really important that this not just be a U.S. tech or a U.S. ethical social framework question.
And I think that's actually a really good sentiment to end the panel on. So, and we are out of time, so let's thank everyone. Great, thanks. Can just, yeah, we can just.
Oh, right, hand mics. Okay. So I should probably get, well, there's one hand mic here.
You were looking at
Okay, great. So I will pass you with an intro, if that's okay. Great. Okay, everyone, can we sit down, please? Right. Perhaps if the town centre could whip people in instead of standing around, that would be good.
Do you mind encouraging people to just get started to take an open seat? Like some people who are sitting on the side or the back want to sit.
Sorry, say what? He wants to sit in their chairs.
Know that they can find open chairs.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, if everyone wants to sit down, there are open chairs. I know it's kind of embarrassing where you have to say to people, could you move up, or is that being used? But if people at the back can find open seats and sit down, that would be great. We can start the afternoon session. And I'm really delighted that we have two people here to talk about, if you like, the future challenges. And you know, one of the things which always occurs to us when we're trying to teach computational journalism or think about how the field is changing is that a lot of the all of the technical challenges and quite a lot of the ethical challenges happen to fields outside journalism before they happen to journalism. And probably one of the areas which is kind of it's most understood to be analogous to ours is in healthcare. Not least because, again, you're dealing with, you know, personal data, live subjects. You have that issue of disclosure versus privacy, and issues of, you know, what is for the greater good versus the personal good. So we thought that to kind of expand on how the most forward-looking areas are dealing with some of those challenges, we couldn't really have two better discussants. We have our friend Josh Benton, who is the editor-in-chief at Nieman Lab up at Harvard. And we have Ruchita Chandra, who is at the IBM Watson Health Project. And a bit of Watson started here, I believe. I'm looking at Julia Hirschberg there, who will nod in agreement. So it's always great to have anybody from the Watson Project coming and talking here. So I'm going to hand my microphone over to Ruchita and let Josh take it away.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that is very true, Emily, that looking to other fields, other domains, other industries that have faced similar sorts of challenges is a great way to attack these sorts of ethical questions. You were here during the morning session, and again for the panel that we just went through. I'm curious what sorts of similarities and or differences you saw between the overarching ethical questions that we're dealing with in journalism versus the ones that you and other folks at Watson at IBM are dealing with in healthcare.
I think in terms of similarities, the big similarity is that both those professions are kind of grappling with what's the best way to adopt these new technologies. Both doctors and journalists need to adopt new mediums to continue growing in AI and machine learning. In terms of the differences, I think it's data governance is a big issue in healthcare. So privacy of data, HIPAA compliance, those form the basis of any healthcare-related progress that's being made. Versus in journalism, it seems like the data is more open and easily accessible.
Have you found that the restrictions on how you can use data within Watson are mostly things that are governed by laws and regulations? In other words, is it HIPAA and things like HIPAA that is governing your decision makings, or how many times are you having to make decisions about data usage, data storage, data sharing that aren't covered in a way that you recognize by existing regulations?
It happens fairly often. HIPAA is just one part of it, but you have to consider your production environments and what's the best way to build those production environments. The healthcare use case is pretty new, so building those production environments in a way that sharing beyond HIPAA is like discussing with patient data, but not necessarily for HIPAA purposes. It's an issue we're still tackling.
Okay. I wonder if you could maybe, I think everyone here has some idea what Watson is. I mean, it's very well branded with TV commercials and things like that. Maybe you could talk specifically about sort of the promise of personalized medicine. What, you know, if I am a patient, I have a set of symptoms and I go to my doctor and the doctor has trouble figuring out what's going on and he or she uses Watson, what are the kinds of things that Watson would be able to do in an ideal situation?
There's a few big ones. One of them that's you might have heard of is Watson for Oncology. The idea is that it can tell you customized treatments, and if you have a genetic mutation, it can help figure out what's the impact of a mutated DNA on your treatment pathway. So Watson for Oncology is the big one. It can tell you the probability that a particular treatment will be effective for you, and so it provides a lot of evidence while recommending a particular treatment plan. So it'll link your genomic and your molecular data with the patient so that the doctor is well informed before picking a certain treatment plan.
And what are the inputs that would help Watson make that decision? In other words, how does it know? Is it looking primarily on a body of research? Is it primarily looking at the genomic elements of other patients who have been using Watson? What are the inputs?
That's a good question. I think the majority of the inputs, at least for Watson, that I know of are literature and guidelines for treatments that are being ingested into the Watson system. And once they're ingested, there's various machine learning models that are performed on them.
One of if there's one phenomenon of the 21st century that I think goes across all fields, it's the increasing distrust of institutions, whether that includes us folks in the media or Congress or the banking system or whatever. But doctors, for the most part, have not faced that same sort of issue. People do trust their doctors. Survey data will tell you. How do you, as someone who is trying to, you're introducing a corporate product and what at the very least could be perceived as a black box into that process. What are the kinds of things that you do to try and increase trust in Watson, the same way that journalists who work with data have tried to wrestle with the idea of how can we make sure that our readers understand this and will buy it?
There's a lot of ongoing work, but the few things that I know of are there's internal committees for internal ethical committees. So every single developer in the area has to go through training within the company to make sure they're well informed of ethical dilemmas in that area. The other is, you might have heard of it, it's been in the news, the partnerships of AI, which is a bunch of different companies. There's Amazon, Google, DeepMind, Facebook, Microsoft, and IBM. And they're discussing more of the long-term impacts of AI. And then some of the other ones are collaborations with academia to make sure that there's a lot of collaborations on ethics, and along with machine learning and natural language processing, there's also a lot of ethical discussions going on.
And I would presume that the marketing schemes and the TV ads that I see, seeing a very sensible robotic voice providing easy solutions to difficult questions, that's probably similar sort of branding for the bot, and so that if a doctor says, Watson tells me this, presumably the patient will say, oh, I saw him give good tennis advice.
Right, so just to clarify, I think Watson's point of view in terms of this area is that Watson, at least Watson Health, doesn't plan to replace doctors in any way. They're supposed to augment intelligence, not replace it. And so the idea is that there's a lot of other things that doctors could be doing. It takes an oncologist 160 hours a week to keep up with the ever-growing amount of literature in the area. And instead of spending the 160 hours trying to catch up with literature, they can use it for analyzing and doing other things that would be more useful with their time.
One of the trend lines in the previous discussion and through this morning's talk is the tension between being fully transparent about how data analysis happens, how data science happens, versus the fear of maybe just being perceived as this black box where inputs go in and some sort of solution or data point comes out. I'm wondering how you think about that. I'm thinking particularly of how Gerry from Slack in the previous panel said, there are times when we will take a worse algorithm, a worse model that we can explain well over a better model that we can't explain as well. A, I'm curious how you answer that, and B, I hope the answer is you take the better model, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in healthcare, over all other areas, I think in healthcare you have to be able to explain why you're going for a certain treatment plan. And so I completely agree, like being able to explain is way more important than a better model. And the way we do that is, let's say there's a 90% chance that treatment's effective, it'll tell you exactly why there's a 90% chance, how that number came about, what are the links to the data. And if it needs other information, which sometimes you don't have enough information to make a decision, it'll let you know. So it's an interactive system. It accepts feedback into the model. So it's not a one-way street. It gets feedback wherever it's lacking.
So in other words, if a patient gets told that this model is going to work, this treatment path is going to work, Watson will eventually learn whether it did and bring that back to inform the model?
If there's any errors in its reasoning, it will iterate on it.
Okay, but that is part of so the doctors who are using Watson are also giving data into it?
Yeah,
Okay.
so like, in terms of the sources of information that where the information is coming into Watson, there's clinical notes, there's speech, text, any sort of information that you can get. It's not just prescriptions, it's not just claims, it's not one type of data. We try and get every possible form of data that we can get. That includes scans and any form of information, basically.
Great. One of the things that has been consistent also in terms of from the journalism perspective is the very disparate levels of quality in the data that gets fed into data. We were this morning we were talking about a journalism project where the people working on it spent 6 to 9 months just cleaning data and linking tables together, which I hope is a record because I hope no one ever had to do more than that. The medical literature that feeds into Watson suffers some of the same problems that all academic research does. You know, psychology research is sort of famed or infamous for having a lot of information about what 20-year-old college students think, because that's the subject base that they're drawing on. And there are, of course, lots of biases around men get studied more than women. People in the US get studied more than people in the Sudan. How do you try to correct for those sorts of input weaknesses in the studies that go into the system?
So there's two parts. I think it takes us just as long in terms of data sanitization, so I agree with that part. In terms of how do we correct it, when you have skews in data, you can try and normalize your data, so there's transformations you can apply to your data to make it normalized. The other kinds of things we do are transfer learning, so if you have inflation, for instance, and you can't predict costs in one year and put them on the other because there's differences in costs, you can perform certain techniques like transfer learning to apply models made for a given data set to another data set.
In your experience, what are the kinds of weaknesses that you see in that data set that goes in? What are the things that are missing?
I haven't interacted with all possible data. We've acquired a bunch of different companies.
Join the club.
But some of them that I've seen are kind of health records are not very complete in a lot of cases, depending on where you're getting them from. So incomplete data is a big issue because you can't do much with it if there's a lot of missing values. And then being able to distinguish between the different kinds of missing values, like is it a null or is it just because they didn't have a condition? So being able to like differentiate between the various kinds of incorrect and missing data is important. Yeah.
We were discussing before this talk, if you were trying to train a self-driving car on the streets of Palo Alto, the car is going to learn very different things than what they would learn on the streets of Mumbai, right? So if Google tries to take those learnings, hashtag learnings, and transfer them to another environment, you might get very different results.
Yeah, so to add to that, like diversity of training data is really important, like for healthcare, because a lot of the AI efforts have been focused in US and Europe, but being able to build a healthcare solution across the world requires a lot more healthcare data than just specific to the US and Europe, and especially because healthcare trends are different across the globe, so being able to get access to data across different countries is really important.
How does Watson think about, or how do you guys think about going direct to consumer versus going direct to healthcare providers? In other words, doctors are an obvious use case, but you can imagine that whether it's IBM or someone else, that being able to go direct to consumer is a model that some people would find appealing and others dreadful.
That's a good question. I think the focus that Watson's been taken from what I've seen is B2B so far, business to business. And that's not just in healthcare, across all different sectors of manufacturing. Most of the industries they're in are B2B. So I'm not sure about what the direct customer interfacing is just yet.
One of the questions that journalists or anyone else dealing with large data sets has to think about is who is a potential beneficiary or who is potentially damaged by the analysis and release of this data. And in the healthcare field, I understand Watson doesn't do this, at least at this point, but one element of this is analysis to see whether someone's risk profile is such that an insurance company should or should not give him or her insurance. And if certain proceedings in the Senate go a certain way, then that may be a more important question in the United States very soon. When you're thinking about data analysis, how do you resolve the tension between wanting to provide a good product and a good solution to your customer, who in your case is a doctor and in other cases might be an insurance company, versus sort of the end user? Because if an insurance company came to you or to another company and said, we want to find out whether this guy is going to cost me $5 million in treatment over the next 2 years, you're helping the company by saying, don't give him insurance, but you're not helping him.
So your question's more around how do you deal with cases where
the potential stakeholders have interests that are in tension, I suppose.
It's coded in the beginning of the contract, I feel. So it differs depending on the case that you're tackling. But they make sure it's well codified at the time of the contract.
Okay. And just going back to the discussion in the last panel about sometimes the individual and societal needs don't point in the same direction.
Yep.
One question that I can say concerns me about broader trends in the news business is the fact that we've seen, and if anyone who knows anything about digital advertising knows that Facebook and Google, these two giant companies, have grown to completely dominate the space. Depending on who you believe, either 85 or 99% of all digital advertising growth in this country goes to those two companies. So that includes in the 1% or the 15% Twitter, LinkedIn, the New York Times, every website you've ever been to. And their dominance is really built around having a better and more thorough data set about users than anyone else. Facebook knows who all my friends are. They can see what websites I go to. Google knows all my search intentions. They can search my Gmail, et cetera. And I think there's a real worry in the media business that the concentration of power in a few technology companies has a variety of either, in some cases, immediately obvious, and in some cases, not so immediately obvious, potential dangers. And I think about IBM is a large tech company, maybe not as big as Apple or Google, but I wonder about the point to which someone today, if you go to a doctor and you want to get a second opinion, there's another doctor you can go to. I would worry about a time when there might be only Watson and Google or Facebook Health, God forbid, or whatever to sort of go to. I mean, how do you think about that concern of scale? Because since data works better at scale, and a lot of the technologies we've been talking about are focused on scale, but there's that risk for the marketplace.
I agree, that is a big risk, having a monopoly of the data sets. I know there's efforts by companies like OpenAI that are trying to democratize the data sets. But that's why you have partnerships amongst these companies, which not only involve the big companies, but they also have nonprofits and academia, and it's the whole point of having that partnership is to get anyone who wants to speak up about it to come and join them and give their opinions about how to deal with these issues. In terms of being able to open source data, to be honest, you can't do that yet. So I agree that it'll be really useful to have large data sets to play around with for finding cures of diseases, et cetera. But I don't think any companies are doing that just yet or have any intention to. But I mean, in fact, there's been controversies in London where I think DeepMind had data from Royal London that was where the patient didn't explicitly consent to giving their data for it. So what's happening as a result of that, there's been, I think, an uptick in the amount of security and security technologies that are being built for healthcare transactions. So blockchain is an emerging technology that's picking up because of secure healthcare transmissions.
So how are you thinking about using blockchain?
It's
To
in
the
its
degree you can say that.
it's in its early phases. It's being experimented with.
What would be the promise of that in your mind?
It's just easier to send medical history records across patients, across insurance companies, across clients. It's a more secure, easier way of sending transmissions.
I'm going to ask another leading question. We consent to things on the internet all the time. Every time we sign up for a new account somewhere, we are saying okay to an end user license agreement. We are, in many cases, giving companies permissions to do things. And what consent means, and informed consent means, differs across different domains. I know that the answer is you feel that everything that you're doing has been given consent, but I'm just, I guess, curious about how you can, as an institution, make sure that that your systems are in place, that the data that you're using is being used in a way that the people who generated that data would approve of.
So in terms of policies that are being built to make sure that the data is being securely transmitted, it's very clearly defined in your contract how your data is going to be used, and any patients patients are well aware of how the data is going to be used. So I think if you're well informed about how it's being used, you're better, you're more likely to give it up.
Okay. One thing that is maybe an age-old question, and maybe it will seem dumb in 20 years, but when you say that, it's great that an oncologist doesn't have to spend 60 hours. I hope they're spending 60 hours reading literature. I don't know what else they're doing, but that they're not having to do that to keep up with that. But I also think back about how when I was in elementary school, I'm the old man on the panel, we didn't use those fancy calculators to do arithmetic, and now in elementary schools they're using calculators. Or I think about how I used to be really good at finding things in the library. If you set me loose in a library right now, I wouldn't know what the hell to do, because all my energy has gone towards using more automated tools like Google. Is there any element in which you worry that doctors who might become too reliant on the tools that you provide? Is there any sort of counter-education process or anything that you think would be a useful way to keep to not let the people be too reliant? Or is that a false question because it's fine that I don't have to do multiplication in my head anymore?
I think it's a fair concern. I mean, you probably wouldn't be able to do mental math as well as before you had a calculator. Similarly, doctors would get rusty in terms of the skills that would be automated. But the extra time that they have is used for a lot better things. And in addition, the curriculum that would be built for medical professionals would be a lot different once AI is more involved. The kinds of things you're learning right now in medical school will be very different, just as you probably learn a lot less of that kind of math in school because you had a calculator. So I think the curriculums would adopt. In fact, even in computer science curriculums, there's a lot of talk of ethics being a part of the core curriculum that's being offered now. And it's just that the curriculum evolves with technology, and that'll be the same in healthcare.
Would you say that there are any noteworthy differences in the ethical system that Watson as an institution or IBM as a company use regarding healthcare matters and the ethical policies that a doctor or a nurse would have? Are there any elements in which they might differ in any way?
So you mean the ethical policies of?
Yeah, I mean, so you're relying, for example, on a much larger data set than any individual doctor is likely to be doing. I'm just wondering if there are any distinctions that you see between those two sets of ethical standards.
So large data sets in terms of what doctors are using versus that are publicly available?
Well, sure. I mean, being you able to use data from other patients and things like that.
I see. The data is being used to find patterns. It's not necessarily being used to de-anonymize people. So I think there's as long as you have statistically valid methods of anonymizing the data, being able to do most things on it wouldn't give away much. So I think there's good techniques in place, and in fact, once you acquire companies, the kind of companies you acquire typically have good practices in terms of anonymizing data. So you're dealing with just finding patterns within the data. There's no way you can decouple.
Because you mentioned that IBM recently acquired, what firm was the firm? True. And what did they bring into the company?
They have a really good, like I mentioned before, one of the bad data sets are those that have missing and invalid values. They're very good about not having those kind of issues with their data. It's a large population and it's a good data set.
One other area that we've talked about in the context of journalism is the role of bots in a chat environment. I know about Verta Health, which is a diabetes startup that is taking data from your continuous glucose monitor and sending you text messages saying, oh, you really shouldn't have eaten that cupcake or whatever, your blood sugar's gone through, to try and use that sort of data set to intelligently prompt these sorts of issues. We mentioned talked earlier about chatbots that are being used on depression and trying to deal with that. I'm wondering how those ethical issues might be different when you are putting something specifically in a human voice. I would think that with depression in particular, making sure that you're not saying the wrong things in a chat session is very important.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty sensitive topic. And the other thing is, do you want it to be clear that the person you're talking to is an AI or not? So I think it's a tough issue, but I think the benefits of it far outweigh the cons. For instance, there've been like Siri is really good with. There's been studies that show that people with autism have a great time with Siri because you might not be able to pick on the social cues with people, but having someone polite and nice and giving you responses that are informative would help people with autism. And there's been other cases where chatbots or in general conversational assistants have been really good with medical conditions.
My last question, you are not a journalist, but you've been hearing a lot about AI and journalism for the last few hours. Given that your industry is in a more advanced stage of ingesting these technologies into their workflows and their business models and the rest, any advice you would give those of us in the backwards land of journalism on how to deal with AI as a technological force?
Well, I don't have much of a journalism background, but I do think there's a lot that you can learn from companies, but specifically of all the domains that there's data out there, healthcare is one of the ones that has the most data compared to any other, even astronomy and any other fields. So given the fact that there's a lot more data available in other fields, there's a lot in terms of what are the best way to deal with data issues, privacy concerns, how to deal with biased data. There's a lot of techniques that can be used from them. So not necessarily for journalists in general, but I think computational journalists could pick up a lot from the techniques that are being used in tech companies.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, both. Sorry, I only need the one microphone. People are going to rearrange the stage behind me, miraculously, I'm told, in under 2 minutes. So we go to our final panel of the day, and I'm very grateful to our moderator, Christopher Mims of the Wall Street Journal, who I think is probably grateful to be here because he's escaping from Uber stories today, or maybe not grateful to be here because he's escaping from Uber stories. So the next panel is called AI in the Newsroom, Technology and Practical Application. I'm going to let Chris introduce the panelists. If everybody wants to come up onto the stage, that would be great. And I'm going to suggest, if you want to, Chris, that certainly take questions. You don't have to stick to the don't take questions because we're really short of time. If we don't have time to take questions, there will be drinks afterwards, immediately afterwards. Again, it's great to hear the conversations and see people talking to each other. And I will keep my closing remarks very short so you have slightly more time. Thanks, Chris.
All right, so since I've been given that authority, I am going to allow questions if the audience is sufficiently engaged during our panel. And I need to turn on my lav mic. Wait, oh, there you are. Yeah. You can hold that. Let me turn this on. Is that working? Hear me? Yeah? Okay, so now we get to the how-to section of today. and practical applications of AI in the newsroom. All of us here did some research beforehand about what those applications are, and I can tell you with some level of confidence that to a first approximation, there is no AI in the average newsroom. Of course, that's one reason we're all here. There are some cool examples, though, and we're going to get to talk about those today. Of course, you've all heard about narrative science and this idea that we're going to automatically generate news articles. So a few years ago, we were all supposed to be out of a job. That hasn't worked out. Of course, what we just heard about from BuzzFeed, that's fascinating. There's tons of interesting work being done in terms of analytics and distribution of news. And then what we heard about from Quartz in terms of conversational bots and delivering news in that way, which obviously Facebook is big on. Haven't seen a lot of it yet. So I thought we could start. We're going to get to those examples, but let's just start with just a brief, everybody can do like a 2-minute introduction, who you are, and what you're going to bring to this topic today. Go for it.
Hi, I'm Judith Donath. I'm at the Berkman Center at Harvard University. I guess the most relevant piece for AI and journalism that I'm working on these days is I'm working on a book about technology, trust, and deception. And it certainly has been a great year for deception and technology and journalism. So I've actually put my book a bit on hold while I tried to figure out a little bit more about the role, the growing, or perhaps always very large but not always recognized role of deception within society. I guess the two pieces that I'm most interested in terms of journalism are, first of all, one of the things I've been interested in for quite a long time is the more, sometimes what we think about is this more science fiction side of AI. Because there's AI that, especially as a programmer, people sort of joke that it was always like things we didn't quite know how to do, and then once we knew how to do them, they became natural language processing or machine learning, et cetera. But then there's the other side of AI that really is the intelligence side, which are bots and robots and other things that we end up having relationships with as independent entities. And there's inherently a deceptive element to that because they give us the impression of having a brain and a personality and intentions when they are a machine with a particular kind of interface. So from the journalism side, I'm very interested now as these types of entities become our news delivering systems. For instance, Alexa is the obvious example. And then the other side is I have been interested in journalism and news for quite a long time. Before some of you were born, I think, I did a master's thesis on news and how you could do effectively what's kind of like Google News now, but about how you could present news online and retain your sense of the sources. And those pieces now really come together because when you think about what's true in news or what's real, it's not just a matter of the literal words. A lot of our understanding of that has to do with what the source of that news story is. If you saw the headline, Trump made a brilliant speech this morning, it means something different if you see it on Fox News or in Breitbart, or if it's the New York Times saying that. It's a very, very different meaning. Your assessment of its truth is different. As we read things online, and there's a lot more machine creation of the presentation, we lose a lot of what the sources of that news are. Certainly at the extreme, if you're getting your news from Alexa, you really hear it in Alexa's voice, not the Washington Post's voice or Fox News's voice. So how we read the intentions and trustworthiness of our news providers is a lot of what I'm interested in.
Hi, I'm Sam Bowman. I'm a new faculty member at NYU in the Center for Data Science there, and I work as part of the larger kind of silver-branded AI and machine learning lab. Until pretty recently, I was at Stanford as a PhD student in the AI lab there and spending some time doing research at Google. I'm not a journalist in any capacity. I've not collaborated all that much with journalists. I'm a natural language processing and machine learning researcher. My kind of main research goal, the main project that I'm working on is sort of sentence or paragraph level language understanding. Is trying to build computational systems that can read a short text and really fully understand the literal meaning and the kind of easy metaphorical or inferred meaning, and be able to answer questions about the text, translate the text, judge what implications might follow from the text, things like that. This is something that people in natural language processing have been attacking for many, many years. It's still very hard. We're making progress. I should also say I'm here somewhat as a representative of the deep learning community. Sort of deep learning or artificial neural networks research is an especially well-hyped subset of the machine learning universe. A lot of that hype is unjustified, but it's also where a lot of the real acceleration of progress has come from in areas like sort of very hard natural language understanding problems or hard computer vision problems. And just on sort of one comment relative to journalism, it sounds like the consensus here is that no one's jobs are going away as a result of this sort of narrative science style article generation. And I would just very much echo that sentiment that there's no need to worry anytime soon. I see a lot of areas in which AI can be applied to journalism with interesting and powerful and maybe problematic consequences. But I think the notion of really generating long-form coherent text without a very clear journalist-specified template is quite far away. I think a good example of kind of where the state of that technology is sometime, I believe last summer, someone put together a short film that was generated by a neural network language model, and you'll notice that the individual sort of exchanges and the dialogue in that film might make sense, but as soon as you sort of zoom out and look at an entire scene, there's really no notion of coherence. And that's been something that we've been struggling with a lot in natural language processing, is we can get systems that can work at some level with text coherence, that can understand it to some degree, but really building systems that are able to go all the way from an abstract idea or a set of facts to a long-form coherent text is still something that's quite difficult.
Great. I'm Meredith Whitaker. I just want to thank Emily, Mark, George for having me. This is a really necessary and great convening. I am the founder of Google's Open Research Group, and I am also, with Kate Crawford, the co-founder of the AI Now initiative. And this is an independent research initiative based here in New York City, looking at the social impacts of AI technologies. So I'm likely fairly problematic for this panel. It might have fit in better with the last panel. But we look at things, what are the social impacts that we are experiencing now and in the near future as whatever we're calling AI, which is, as Sam mentioned, this kind of overhyped term along a number of dimensions, what are the impacts of using those to make critical decisions, determinations, predictions across our core social institutions? And of course, journalism and the Fourth Estate obviously counts, especially right now. We're in fraught political times. So, we look at these issues across four basic categories. The first you're familiar with from the discussion this morning, and the last panel, bias and inclusion. But this is really, data comes from the culture and context in which it's created. My background is in large-scale measurement systems, so I have very little trust in data because I tried to create it for a number of years. What does it mean to create models within a certain context that are then applied to another context? And just one quick example. There was a researcher at, I think, the University of Massachusetts Amherst who looked at the text recognition capabilities using Twitter data. And so using that data, ethical or not, he was looking at what type of speech and texts can be recognized and what can't be. And what he showed was that even Twitter's own text recognition capabilities were 50% less likely to recognize African American dialect as, quote, English. So, if you think about using, bots for gathering, or AI for gathering news from Twitter, if you think about, what will be legible, what won't be legible, that is a technology with a large African American population, in which, for whatever reason, the recognition capabilities hadn't been trained to understand that as language. So that's one example of bias, and I think that this is sort of an issue that is endemic to all of these technologies and really needs to be centered during the decision-making process of, do we or do we not use AI? AI Now is also looking at rights and liberties. I think this is a huge issue right now. We have Trump in office. We have a turn toward the which may or may not be kind of receding with some of the recent European election results. And we have firms like Cambridge Analytica, which are designed to propagate propaganda throughout the news ecosystem such that there's enough confusion that it's difficult to know what's real. If you think of that as input data for some of the AI that might be used in responsible newsrooms, that gets really frightening. It's very difficult to tell the difference. You know, a lot of these systems simply weren't designed with that in mind. We're also looking at labor and automation, so this gets right to the heart of the newsroom. Do journalists become sort of glorified, you know, to use Lily Arani's term at UC San Diego, glorified data janitors, right? Are they just kicking recalcitrant machines, checking work that's done by systems created far outside of their contexts? Or are we looking at something that is truly empowering? And finally, we look at critical infrastructure and safety. And this is where I, you know, as somebody who also worked in security and privacy realms, I get really worried about what seems to be a vast ability to game these systems if you had a concerted and dedicated adversary, right? You know, given as Amanda was saying, you know, the lack of available data, given the fact that a lot of these resources are scarce and people are going to be under pressure, you know, how would you game these by sort of offering data, offering tools that may serve one interest or another? So those are the types of issues I look at and putting them in context for this room.
Hi. Hello? Hello. I'm Mark LaValle. I work at the New York Times. I run a thing called StoryX, which we bill as newsroom-based research and development. If you think about the daily demands of a newsroom, and you think about the goals of an R&D group, that can sound a little bit like an oxymoron. I think one of the things that we're fortunate in is that on both sides, sort of the forward-looking side, particularly working with people outside the building and then working with a number of colleagues across different groups in the newsroom, we're trying to be a connector between things we could be doing in the near future and things that we could be taking advantage of today. And so in thinking about AI, the few bets we're placing and experiments we're running, really trying to understand how we can use AI in different ways at scale in our newsroom. So in addition to, you know, being able to do either statistical or machine learning based things around individual stories, how can we put more power in the hands of more journalists in the building and around the world? So a few very quick examples to illustrate this that maybe we can dive into a little bit more in the panel. One thing that we talked about a little bit this morning, and that there's been some press about recently, some of what we're doing is finding partners to work with who are essentially machine learning AI experts, and so one of those being Google. We have been working with a part of Google called Jigsaw to be able to understand from a chunk of text how toxic that chunk of text might be, and that has an application in comment moderation. And so what we gave Google was, I think, about 13 million comments that have been submitted to New York Times over the years, both the approved comments and the rejected comments. And so they were able to, with data from other sources like Wikipedia as well, build that toxicity rating. And so that's one factor in our comment system that allows us to significantly increase the percentage of articles that we have comments on. So I think you said 20 earlier. I think it's might be a little bit lower than that in practice. I think it's because it's a set number every day. But our goal is to get that up to 80% by the end of the year. And so that's a thing that we want to do, not just for the New York Times, but for anyone who wants to improve the sort of quality of comments and community on their site. Another example, a thing that we're looking at is the sort of solutions that are commercially available by companies like IBM with Watson, Microsoft's cognitive services, things like that, to understand what situations we can start to rely on them particularly in news production. So real-time audio transcription, computer vision, things like that. These aren't perfect yet, but particularly when we are sort of like aiding and speeding up projects that our folks in our newsroom are already working on, we can sort of help get things out faster and maybe do a little bit more in real time. So that gives us an opportunity with individual news events to try things out, to understand the progress that those technologies are making. And then a third example, I think, is trying to understand where the machine learning tool chain is starting to get to the point where people without deep math skills and things like that, sort of like the developers that you're more likely to find in a newsroom these days are able to start taking advantage of these technologies. And so we have a few problems that have been kind of problems on the list for a number of years now. One example of that is we have about 8 million photos in our morgue. They're literally in the basement of our building that have not yet been digitized. They go back about 100 years. All the rights data was manually written or stamped on the back of those photos over the years. And so we don't know what photos we have the rights to use digitally and which ones we don't. And so that sounds vaguely like a machine learning problem. We haven't really found the magic solution yet that we can just like dump 8 million photos into that will give us the answers. But I think as we start to see those kinds of tools that become more kind of like possible for mere mortals to be able to use, that's the kind of thing where that sort of provides a good opportunity to experiment with that to see what progress that's making, and then we can understand how to apply those kinds of tools, those higher order tools, to other problems that exist within our newsroom as well. So those are just kind of 3 examples of how we're tracking this whole area of development.
Hi, I'm Sasha Koren. I'm the editor of the Guardian Mobile Innovation Lab, which is based here in New York at the Guardian US's offices. And we are sort of like Mark's team, a small innovation group within the context of a larger organization. And we were set up really to experiment with and make progress on storytelling on small screens in the service of sort of pushing the industry forward on the notion that mobile adoption is only increasing. With the latest statistics came out yesterday from Pew, saying that now something like 85% of Americans over 65 are now the fastest growing mobile body, but are getting their news from mobile in some capacity. So within that, we started about a year and a half ago sort of looking at the various opportunities of where we thought news could do better with mobile storytelling. One of the areas that we decided to focus on was something based around the sensors and permissions that are inherent in mobile phones. Off of the back of that, we, through a lot of kind of discussion over the past year, one of our developers, Connor Jennings, who's here in the audience, came up with an idea to sort of play around with a concept for a recommendation, an offline reading app that would offer you recommendations based on the time of your commute. And we have sort of some future-looking plans to also play around with other kinds of permissions. So the things that we're sort of interested where it comes to AI are machine learning, obviously, but also recommendations and how much those resonate with users. We do a lot of sort of thinking and talking and also some user research, thinking about where the products that we make and the experiments that we do resonate with our audiences. It's one thing to sort of think about them in the context of what makes sense for a newsroom and what makes sense for us as journalists and as journalist developers, and another to actually come up with ideas that are actually really serving needs. And that's, of course, I mean, I think this year has shown now more than ever that that's what we are here for. We're here to serve that public. And so engendering their trust, engendering products that really speak to them is sort of incumbent on us. So we're looking at that hard. We're also looking at, in the process of creating this, initially a prototype, and hopefully it will carry out from that. We're looking at what we ask of users in exchange for permission to give them a service. So as Josh noted earlier, we're constantly giving up our permission to things and offering up our data in order to get services. And so, it's very easy to say, yes, I will give you Instagram or mapping app access to my location data, but we don't necessarily understand the implications of that downstream. I think we've all had a creepy data story somewhere. My latest one was that I was joking with my brother about a member of our family who snores and we were talking about this over the phone, over like voice. The next day on Facebook, and I hadn't talked or typed in anything about snoring in any service anywhere in God knows how long. But the very next day, I was served up an ad on Facebook for some kind of gadget that would supposedly make snoring, would fix your snoring. And I found this unbelievably creepy and thought it's quite possible that I'm being crazily paranoid and this is just a total coincidence. It's also quite possible that I gave permission unknowingly to some app, either Facebook or to some other service, to listen to my calls or to access to my microphone. And I've tried to sort of backtrack and look through terms of service and look through data. The closest I could get was to recognize that I had given microphone access to Instagram. So, but I don't know if that, the point being is that these processes where it comes to technology companies are not made transparent, and I think it's really incumbent on us within journalism when we're making products and services that are looking at permissions to do a much better job and to sort of encourage trust and to sort of also give a bit of a window, if we can, into what we're doing with that data and what the choices are that person is making and what they imply. That's easier said than done, but it's something that we're thinking about.
So we got some great applications from Mark and Sasha, but of course, I know that some other panelists have some of their own favorites. Sam, if you don't, we can just jump right over you. But if Judith, if you could start with an example of AI really being used either to create or distribute news.
Okay. I'm going to use the example that I mentioned briefly in my introduction of Alexa because it's a familiar one, but I think there's elements of it we don't really think about that much, which is what are the relationships that we start to have with services like this? And why is this different than getting your news in some other way? Part of it, several years ago, there was a really interesting study that was done by Lee Sproul and some of her colleagues, where she had people come in. They were told that there was some experiment having to do with job searching online. Some of the people saw an interface with just text. Some of them saw the same interface, but it spoke to them and it had like a little cartoon face. And it was asking sort of job-related questions and like little, the little things they ask in those sort of job interviews, like, have you ever stolen any office supplies or anything? And it turned out that people were a lot more truthful to the machine that had just text. And they weren't as truthful to the one with the face. They were told they worked harder to make a good impression on the face. They didn't tell it that they'd ever stolen a paper clip, where they would tell the text one that, he stole like a couple of pencils or something. And the analysis of it is that when you deal with something that you see as having agency and potentially having an opinion of you, you tend to strive to make it be an opinion you find favorable. And so whenever we deal with things that we can anthropomorphize, and it turns out that humans are really, really good at anthropomorphizing things that never, even a cloud or a tree or something, we see agency in things very easily. But when we're looking at sort of AI like entities, bots and social robots and these things like Alexa, they have been deliberately designed to make you anthropomorphize them, to see them as having some kind of personality, to having some kind of an intent. And a lot of it would be quite a struggle to not try to please them in some way. And so that's an extremely different relationship than you tend to have with, say, your newspaper, which you don't really worry that, like, you don't sit down and read the newspaper and think, oh my God, the newspaper is going to think I'm really shallow because I read the style section before I read the newspaper. But if you're dealing with getting your news from things that you feel start to have an opinion of you, your relationship with what you do, or your willingness to question what it tells you to read, or your willingness to go along with its opinion. Like, think about how hard it can be to be with some friends who, not that you're diametrically opposed politically, but you're a little bit opposed to something you say. We succumb to peer pressure very easily, and we can succumb to peer pressure when that peer is a machine. And so that's sort of the first stage of that delivery side. And then when you think about one of the things that with the web, when the web came out in the 90s, there were a lot of things people foresaw about the future of having lots of things online, having news online, but the one thing we really didn't foresee very well was that it would be advertising driven, and certainly not to the extent that it is today, and how much the force of advertising shapes it. So when you look at the notion of getting your news through a device that is being brought into your house with a very strong advertising bent behind it, where you can't quite tell, even if you've subscribed to the Washington Post on it or the New York Times, we're not quite sure what the voice is. Is it the voice of the device? Is it the voice of the reporter? Is it the voice of the paper? And you don't quite know what are the forces shaping what it wants you to see, because you're not quite sure what the role that advertising or marketing or other sort of hidden agendas are that go into it. I think what we're dealing with, certainly as both the consumers of news, but also the people producing it need to be quite aware of, is a space where the whole editorial side is shifting, and our relationship to understanding why we see news and what we want from it is very, very different. So for me, that's an example that we need to think through very hard in terms of how do we imagine a future in which we have the convenience of those devices, the personalization they can afford, but that a lot of the control goes back both to the editors who care about content and to the consumers who care about what they're getting, and less to the direction it looks like they will be the trajectory they're on now, which is heavily advertising driven and very little about sort of the information being the good in itself.
Anyone else with examples? Favorite examples of AI as a source or a distribution mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, on the, in thinking about AI in the newsroom and how we can be trying this out in practice today. I think Facebook's applied machine learning group, I think, talks about generalized content understanding, and they obviously have some decent amount of content to work with. And I think one of the things we're trying to do is, between understanding the content of images through computer vision and natural language understanding and things like that, they're trying to figure out how to cross those different disciplines and domains to build a sort of a single model of the contents of a post. And I think that we're very interested in understanding that as well. And in practice, real-time audio transcription, computer vision, things like that, and backstopping the work of journalists, whether that's immediately having the notes from your interview as text, those types of things are things where that's 90% accurate. That's going to be more helpful than you actually manually transcribing your hour-long interview or waiting hours for some transcription service to bring that back to you. Things like that. I think that gives us more familiarity and literacy with those types of things, sort of at what is today a smaller scale, but in a way that sort of helps us understand both the sort of current state of these technologies, and also I think that helps us have better conversations internally about how we would take advantage of these things and how we will take advantage of these things when they do work essentially as solved problems. So if you fast forward a couple of years, I don't know exactly when, I guess I have this hope that machine translation just works at internet scale, and you can take anything written in any language and be able to comprehend it in any other language. And that understands metaphors and colloquialisms and cultural references and things like that. However far out that is, I think that's, between here and there, that's something that we should be trying to understand how we can take advantage of, both in understanding what's happening around the world, and then also how to make the New York Times available in other languages in ways where that is some maybe hybrid of human translators and machines or things like that, but basically open up the number of options we have to work with around those things, instead of just waiting for that eventual future to arrive and then try to figure out what we do about it.
This is taking it in a little bit of a different direction. I just wanted to comment on Judith's observations about anthropomorphizing. I'm thinking of Facebook chatbots and how several organizations are experimenting with them, The Guardian included, and how underwhelming, I hope I'm not offending anyone, I've found the experience, and I think that part of that is because the promise of bots in particular and of services like Google Home and Alexa is that they will chat with you as if they are human, and that what you're really doing is querying a database. Whether or not the database has the information that you're looking for or not, it may not. I mean, we have an Echo in the office, and we've been very frustrated with it. And because it's often gets things wrong, we haven't done the work of setting it up to its fullest capacity. But I think that it's not necessarily a human. We have to remind ourselves that it's not necessarily human at the other end of that. A human has made certain choices about what to put within that database, but they are not inherently intuiting what you as the user will want to know from that database. And so I think there's that tension there that in creating certain kinds of services in light of news, we have to think about are we approximating a human sort of form, and to what extent are we promising to deliver on that personal one-to-one back and forth, if that makes sense.
So I love, oh, go ahead.
Can I do a quick answer for that? One piece of that is that these are kind of still in their infancy. And in terms of the technology design, I think an important piece, whether you're for or against these, is the expectation setting. And for instance, one of the issues, like things like any of the voice ones are based on, is that because they use human or human-like voices, you immediately do have the expectation of a human-like intelligence behind them. I just finished a paper on this called Why Play Fetch with a Robot Dog? And ABA was one of the most successful things like that, and they were very specific when they set out to do that research, or that the idea of having a dog was great, because you just elided all those problems with being able to do speech and everything. You kept expectations low, and then everyone was like, and they made it look very mechanical deliberately, so that when it did something cute, it seemed really cute, whereas if it had been really furry, it would have been creepy. And so, so a lot of it is these things will be a lot more, like you will have one that will be much more powerful and influential when a developer thinks, oh wow, if I make it seem really robotic, then when it does something clever, people will really believe it. Whereas right now, you just get all these disappointed expectations. But I think the fact that they are disappointing today doesn't mean that they will be in 5 years.
So maybe it's a question, too, of setting the expectation up front. This is what we can do with this particular bot. This is what we can't. This is sort of I think some do, at least initially, try to teach you how to use it, but that's sort of where it ends.
Just kind of quick piece, though, is that it's also, in terms of a design piece, the biggest problem that I see with them is that being able to mimic things that we see as reliable signs of trustworthiness are very easy. So when you think about a news anchor person, that a lot of what they do is like they use eye contact, they use a certain calm kind of voice. There's all kinds of ways that you give off of how trustworthy you are. It's relatively easy to mimic it, but when you do it on a robot, you can mimic the signals of trust without actually being trustworthy, and that's the scary piece of it.
So in terms of improving these AIs, and this is for you guys in the middle, hopefully it's where you're going already, but if not, feel free to go in a different direction. It seems like creating an AI is actually surprisingly labor intensive, not just in terms of building it, but in terms of creating the corpus of data that is going to train it. And so Google and Facebook make it look easy because they can harvest all of the free labor that's on the internet or on Facebook or whatever. But journalistic organizations don't have that, and we're not in the habit of creating that. So how do we get that? Do we need to hire like 50 interns to tag 10 million images, or just a hypothetical? So where do we go with that in order to improve these or to create new systems?
I can just start on this quickly with a comment that one of the sort of obvious drivers of all of the progress recently in AI has been that we've gotten very, very good at problems where there's a lot of data for some input-output mapping, for some kind of look at this and produce this, where the input could be a little bit complex as long as you have a lot of it, and the output is relatively simple. So this could be something like looking at an image and saying if there's a face in it or where the face is, looking at some text and judging, is this sort of have mostly positive emotions or mostly negative emotions? As we move into problem, and this is, I think, very, very broadly true. If you have a problem where you have a lot of data and a relatively simple kind of output that you want to produce, we really haven't yet found the limits of how much you can put in there. We've gotten very, very impressive systems in that mode. Once you want to produce a complex structured output, once you want to build a system that is producing a coherent conversation or that is producing a news story, those methods start to break down. And it's possible they could eventually be brought to bear on this, and there's a lot of work in that direction, but we just haven't seen the same kind of promise on these complex structured outputs. And so that's something where, at least for the near future, a lot of that progress, I think, is going to come from fairly careful problem-specific engineering of a kind that isn't necessarily going to generalize all that smoothly across languages or across maybe topics of conversation.
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess there are a couple things here, and, thinking about the topic to start of sort of anthropomorphizing AI, and this is something, Joseph Weizenbaum warned about, back in the day. It's been a big issue. I think another thing a lot of these conversations seem to constantly do is sort of naturalize these technologies, that we just have these now, we pick them off the tree, there's certain fruits and we're going to eat them. But in doing my research for this panel, basically what I found was a lot of products that are being sold to newsrooms. And these are APIs you may use and you may license access to. These are some software kit that you might get licensed to. But these are backed by interested parties. They're marketed in certain ways. Their capabilities may do one thing now and another thing tomorrow. And I guess what I'm anxious that's missing from this conversation is how do we validate the claims made by interested parties who don't give us access to the algorithm, who legally and for good reasons in a number of cases can't give us access to the data, who assume that our input data matches whatever the data they use to train these algorithms are, and who are making claims about the efficacy in a field they may or may not understand without giving the people who practice that field the ability to actually say, is this, there's the let's talk of useful, of, impactful, of, how do we know this is useful to people? How do we know it's interesting to people? Like, none of those are attached to any metrics I understand. And at some point, someone's going to have to weight that and be like, does useful mean sort of a dopamine-fueled click? Or does it mean that we check power today in a way that's complicated to understand? So I think, I'm not sure how we improve these technologies, but I think part of it is we start looking at power relationships and we start asking these questions, and we start doubting some of the capabilities that are being kind of sold here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're approaching it with a healthy dose of skepticism. You go to these, corporate websites, and it's this brochure of this glorious present where all these things are magical and you can understand everything about this entire data set, and just upload your data. I won't name names, but since there are only a handful of big players, you can probably guess. One, computer vision API, we trained it to understand members of Congress for this thing we did around the inauguration. For some reason, it thought many of the old white dudes in Congress looked like Al Franken. It came back a lot of times. There were like 40 Al Frankens in Congress as far as it was concerned. A real-time transcription, audio transcription service that we ran on the Comey hearing last week was determined that the former, I think NSA director is General Flan, like the Spanish dessert. Those are the visible error conditions, right? We can see that, and because we're using these in highly controlled situations where that is not then being just sort of like automatically piped out to our readers, we know how to deal with that, and we know if we pull the plug or things like that. I think one of the places where we're looking for legitimate use cases right now is where we do have the existing stops, like the checks and balances, to make sure that any of those, that the error conditions are visible to us before we put that in front of readers. I think fear in trying to do anything in a more automated way are either readers seeing that themselves, in ways that we could have caught with human intervention, and I think this is what you're getting at as well, sort of these invisible error cases where we don't know that it missed something in this data set and we're relying on it for some sort of aggregate understanding and things like that. And I think that that's where I'm not aware of a situation where we've yet placed trust in one of these API-based solutions to do that kind of sort of level of understanding for us.
I mean, just quickly, I think that's totally right. I would also add there are error cases for which there's no ground truth. So, are we informing the public? Did we, is this reaching people who are interested in it, right? Things where you don't have a control data set to be able to check whether this is actually serving the mission of, your journalistic mantra or not. And I think those are things that, need socio-technical analysis. They need more than simply someone, looking at the data, looking at the algorithm in a snapshot. They need to actually be instrumented to measure impact in a way that's much more complex and much more cross-disciplinary than sort of the simply like the ML professional looking at something in the lab.
So one thing I wanted to ask all of you, Facebook is always, I think, the elephant in the room when it comes to AI in the newsroom, because of course it's the monster driver of traffic, and I think it's very telling that maybe the first place that most newsrooms do see any kind of AI is in terms of analytics and like we heard earlier from BuzzFeed, like predictive, like A/B testing and making predictions around what's going to do well where. So in a real sense, as creators of news, do you think we are in an arms race with, for example, Facebook? What are the moral and civilizational consequences of that? Anybody?
What's the statistic that like the average American spends 50 minutes a day on Facebook? Is that anyone? Can anyone fact check that? Is that fake news?
I think that's right. It's like an hour
Something.
plus.
I don't know. I just read that somewhere on the internet.
To
no, but that's this is maybe all I think have to say on this topic. That's what keeps me up at night is in a much broader way the way that there are like moving from the internet of 10, 15, 20 years ago to the one today. It feels like there are many fewer front doors to your time and attention, and that the sort of the networks in using all this social data are operating in much more of a winner-take-all sort of way of being. And I think we both need to understand how to operate on those platforms. Like I think there's a lot to learn from the BuzzFeeds of the world of it having a distributed approach and finding people where they are. But I think that also means that the more beholden we are to them. This is all very obvious and been said many, many millions of times before on panels like this. But the more beholden we are to them, the less power we have. And that, that's a reason why the Times, in having this subscriber first model, is trying to make sure that we retain this direct relationship with our readers, so that we do put things out on Snapchat for them and for non-subscribers and things like that as well, but that there's a reason to still come back to the Times for a variety of things that we can do with you.
Yeah, I don't know if arms race would be the right word, because we need to collaborate with Facebook, and yet they are also really eating our lunch. And making it hard for us to sustain businesses. But I worry far more than I worry about organizations like either of ours. I worry about the local players who do not have our resources, do not necessarily have the ability to go to conferences to sort of inform themselves, and are maybe a little bit more challenged in even reaching their communities, even though those communities are maybe more defined.
I think one of the important pieces is also recognizing that the news is being consumed in such a social way, and how to make that something that journalism works with even better. I think it's wonderful to hear that the New York Times is aiming to have 80% of the stories have comments on them, because understanding how people engage with these stories, how they question them, and figuring out how you write stories, not so much to gain like just more clicks and everything, but how you incorporate people's questions and their opinions and make those discussions a lot more interactive, I think is really important for how people digest and think about, and ultimately you write a story because you want to influence how people see the world and how they think about things. And it's through that kind of engagement that they really are incorporating the meaning of the story in their way of thinking. On the other hand, I think it's also important when looking at Facebook, and much worse, Twitter, that just because there is the data that says how many times has somebody read this story, which ones have the most engagement, it's easy to have too much weight given to that, and more on Twitter than on Facebook. That's been very destructive, because if you are counting the importance of something based on how many likes and retweets it gets, which is a cheap signal of interest, then you get the ability to mimic it with bots and things like that. And so, for instance, one piece there is, should that be a big part of the interface, those numbers? If we now know that those numbers are somewhat meaningless because they're inflated by bot armies that have been instigated through the existence of those numbers, maybe it's time for those numbers to be a less prominent part of the interface. And so understanding how we deal with that knowledge and how people should use it, and because right now I think the pendulum has swung way too far in giving the importance to visible metrics of attention, that you get a not very healthy feedback loop through that. So, so both the engagement on Facebook in terms of looking at the ways that the audience can work with each other, but not looking at it in that sort of simplistic side of just the clicks for attention.
So I think that's actually a great place to end, because we are out of time, and we're ready for closing remarks.
Thank you. So you see, even when I give them latitude to do Q&A, maybe you're engaged. That was a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much indeed. I don't want to be the person who stands between you guys and you can't hear me.
Oh, I think we shut that off.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Hello. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mark. That was a fantastic panel. Thank you very much indeed. This is kind of, new territory for us. Well, it's old territory for us, and it's new territory for us. We're teaching computational journalism here, and we're aware that there are lots and lots of things that we need to be bringing into the classrooms that don't just touch production and distribution, but also touch ethics and sourcing and creation of products around data. So these sets of conversations that we've had today have been enormously valuable. And thank you very much indeed for all of your attention. I don't want to stand between you and the bar, because that's what happens next. So please kind of hang around and have a drink, talk to our panelists, etc. Thank you very much indeed for your engagement. And I think that I just want to echo what Steve Cole said, which is, the world we're going into is much more complex. It is something where we need to really apply journalism and technology in the most efficient way that we can, but also we need to think about what kind of constraints, or what does a journalistic constraint look like in an AI world. So that'll probably be our whole of our next conference. Thanks very much indeed, everyone, for coming. Thank you very much to Chris Mims for being an able anchor throughout the day. Thank you to Mark for the space, and thank you to panelists for their great participation. Thanks.